everyone. I'm Icaro, and welcome to the Therapist Podcast. Today, I'm very proud to present one of my favorite conversations with Jess Mork from Promenade Counseling. She is a mental health practitioner, a psychologist, and also a Reiki practitioner. I do love how she brings in alternative medicines to the practice of psychology and mental health therapy. So I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. And here is Jessica Mork.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah, I'm like a little bit intimidated, but also just like super excited to talk to you because when I got this idea, I was like, Jess is like on the top of my list and I need to talk to her and have her on the show immediately.
Oh, wait, that means so much to me. I low-key feel intimidated being on here because I'm sitting in front of you who is so knowledgeable and who I was just learning so much from. So I'm like,
Good. So we're both nervous.
We're both nervous and we have anxiety and here we are.
Here we are. I love that. I do have kind of like a silly question to ask, kind of actually a selfish question to ask, because I'm calling it the therapist, and you're an actual certified, graduated, degreed therapist.
Yeah.
Are you a little bit offended by like the title, or how do you feel about it?
So I'm not offended. The thing that whenever I see people, because that's like people kind of play on that word a lot for certain things. The only time when I get offended is if people kind of are like, haha, this is funny, but also they kind of low-key think of themselves as therapists, where they're like, oh no, yeah, I'm totally not. But then they also start kind of like merging into territory that's very like, just kind of trying to claim themselves as experts in certain things that they're not actually experts in. That's where I actually thought that was a fantastic title. And I was like, dang, that is like, I was like, there is an element of processing and like journeying that is like tarot and just like the spiritual realm. And so I don't think it's like inaccurate. Again, I've seen other people, I see this a lot with life coaches. And this is kind of where my frame of reference is like, there's so much healing to be done that's not in the therapy space. And so I am like, therapists like do not have a monopoly on like healing. I think the system is set up to maybe imply that, but I definitely do not like hold that as truth. And so all that to say is that like I've seen life coaches before who are like, I'm not a therapist, but I do X, Y, and Z. But then they start like just kind of like start overstepping their bounds. So that's the only time I've ever seen that type of thing in the wild that I get like upset by. But
I'm actually right there with you, because I don't classify myself at all as an expert on therapy and psychology. I'm interested in it. But it's definitely something that I'm like, oh, I do this. I'm a tarot card reader, and I know my limits in my scope of practice. And I'm right there with you too, where like I understand that therapists have had a formal education. I also understand that life coaches have their own formal education. And I'm not calling myself a life coach at all because I don't have that degree either. My thing is all about really tarot. And then I learn other things because I see that they do have like they bleed together in some aspects. The borders are a little bit, they can blur, but not very much. So I'm like, this is my space, and I get to, which is also what I love too, is I get to talk to people like you. Because what my motto has been for a while, I'm smart, but I want to surround myself with people that are smarter than me so I can learn from and grow from and elevate myself in that way and elevate them too. So that's kind of like my point of view.
I love that. Yeah. And honestly, like I have great personal context for you. And I genuinely like loved our time together when we were doing, when you were training me on how to even just like begin to interpret tarot. And I'm still like engaging in that practice. And still, like, I refer back to your papers that you gave me like all the time. I'm constantly pulling up that PDF and I'm looking through it, and just like, it helps me and it guides me. So yeah, I just like, again, because I have that personal context for you, I'm like, oh yeah, like it feels very genuine, and it feels like when you, that title of the podcast, I'm like, oh yeah, I see where he got that. Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, of course.
I feel better.
Good. Oh my God. Yeah. It's very, there's such a fine line between like, you know, trying to make sure that people aren't being dangerous with kind of what they're presenting, and also like gatekeeping. And I feel like that line looks very thin. But truthfully, yeah, I'm just like, healing is for everyone and everywhere. So it's not just for therapists.
I love that. Okay, I had my selfish moment. Now, now I want to talk to you, obviously, and I want to go back to the beginning and tell me about your story, like where you're from, how you grew up, and how you came to be Promenade counseling as Jess.
Yeah. So my journey, I was born in Indiana. And I lived there for about probably 6 or 7 years. And then I lived in Missouri for a bit. And then we moved to Florida when I was probably about like 14. And yeah, I moved a lot. My parents got divorced when I was 6. And they got divorced because my dad is gay, which plays a pretty instrumental role in kind of my upbringing, because I also grew up in a very Christian household. And so there was a lot of, for me at least, there was a lot of internal conflict given the messaging I was receiving from the religion that I grew up in, but then also having this very real experience of having a loving and caring father, and just like what I was receiving and what I was also noticing in my dad just like weren't lining up, in terms of people saying that he was like, you know, gonna go to hell, and that I had to pray for him every single day, and like all of these things. And so that definitely plays a huge role in especially who I am today, and some of the therapeutic spaces that I occupy professionally. And yeah, that's kind of like a little bit. Do you have any questions, or should I just keep going?
If you have more, go for it.
Great. So yeah, like I said, I moved a lot. I moved twice when I was in Indiana, moved 3 times when I was in Missouri, and then from Missouri to Florida was one move, and then I've just we moved once a year until I went to college. So I, yeah, was the new kid all the time. In some senses, it was obviously like I didn't really have any long-term friendships. I don't have childhood friends. Like I don't have somebody who I've known ever since I was like a small child. And it's not like I still, you know, like on Facebook and Instagram, you kind of follow those people, but they're not like my friends that I've been connected with over the years. So yeah, so that's definitely just been something that was, I don't know, a little interesting. But then, you know, on the other end of it, of moving all the time, you get to kind of reinvent yourself every time because you're just a new person. So in that way, it was kind of refreshing. But yeah, I was also homeschooled on and off because depending on where we were living, my parents didn't like the school district. And so, because my mom got remarried to to who is my stepdad today. So, so they wouldn't like certain school districts. And so I would kind of flip flop from being homeschooled to going to public school. Yeah. And I love being homeschooled.
Do you?
Yeah, because I got to be done with school way earlier than anyone else. And I got to start later than ever. I never started school until like 10 or 9 o'clock in the morning. And then I'd be done by like 2. And so it was just like,
that's the dream.
Yes. And then when I was 16 and me and my friends were getting our like driver's licenses, my friends and I would like go out for lunch during a school day because they were also homeschooled. And then, yeah, so there was actually like a lot of fun there. And I'm able to learn independently, like sitting in front of a computer. Like I just am able to do that. And so, yeah, I really, really enjoyed it when I was doing it.
I love that because I'm somebody who I love learning, but at the same time, it is a chore for me to like sit down and like open up a book and like read. And I do prefer having a teacher in front of me. So I love that it sounds like just naturally you built up this this muscle of this discipline muscle of I get to sit down and learn on my own because I've already done that and that's what I know how to learn.
Yeah, for sure.
Now you were talking about there's actually a few things that your story brought up for me. And here's what shut off in my head really quickly. And of course, I want you to demystify it for me and debunk it for me. But you talk about being the new kid all the time, and every year shifting a new school, you get to reinvent yourself. It's kind of cool because I think when we're kids, we're also learning our own identity and figuring out who we are. So to try be somebody different is maybe sounds a little bit refreshing. But also, I wrote down just this quick sentence of hunger to meet new people. Because you as a therapist now, my vision is that you're sitting in front of people and really getting to know deep parts of them. Do you think there's a connection between not really getting to know deep parts of people growing up and now taking the leap into therapy? It's this hunger to meet people?
No one's ever asked that question, I just need to say, and I'm obsessed with the question.
Thank you. Okay.
This is a great question. And I think I kind of need to sit with this for a little bit because I definitely think there is something to that. I definitely think because I do have a desire to get to know people on such a deep level. The other thing too that is interesting in the dynamic is that I'm actually pretty introverted. I like one-on-one time, which is exactly why I'm a therapist. I don't work with like large crowds of people. I like the one at a time thing is my thing. So even in that sense, being the new kid all the time and just kind of being forced in this position of like having to be a little more extroverted than I'm comfortable with to have any social life or any connections was really intense. And so I do love, I just cherish and love getting to know people, and especially that one-on-one time. And then it's comfy for me, so then I'm not feeling like I'm pushed out of my element. And yeah, so it just is a very comfortable experience for me overall.
Okay, that's awesome. And I think it's super important, right? For me, as somebody who is in therapy, there is kind of like a weight, at least for me, to show up to therapy like prepared. Like I did my homework and I have something to talk about. And lately there have been sessions where I'm like, I don't know how to start this. Like, I don't know what to say or like what to talk about.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, do I put it on the therapist, being like, hey, I got nothing. What do you have for me? Or like, how do I have that conversation? Because I'm always kind of like maybe a little bit over mindful of crossing boundaries of like, are we just buddies talking, but not really? Because I'm also like being studied and like how I try to be very open. When I made the decision to like, I really need therapy, I was like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. So I'm going to be fully transparent and like really get into it. So that's been nice. But at the same time, I'm like, now what? Like, what do I talk about now? So how do you deal with those people that maybe are very introverted and are uncomfortable with like, hey, I'm just here. So like, yeah, everything's fine. I went to work today. And then they don't give you the actual depth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So before I answer that question, they're of course doing yard work outside of my apartment right now. Can you hear it? Is that okay?
Actually,
or is it too disturbing? Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. That's great. Okay.
No, I can hear it all. So I was like, awesome. Perfect.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Then we're good. Cause I can go in my closet if I need to. I've done that before.
I go in my closet to record meditations and I'm like, I feel like Harry Potter, just like take a deep breath in and out.
I did that. I recorded a few meditations and I felt like a gremlin, like, okay, and then you're going to breathe in and out. Just like sitting in this tiny closet with all my clothes, like touching me.
Yeah. Like, this is my soundproof studio.
Right, exactly.
State of the arts.
Right. Exactly. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay. Sorry to answer your question. Yeah. So there's kind of like a fork in the road in terms of like, how do I navigate this? The first thing is that, it is a pretty intimidating experience to be like on the spot. And it's kind of one of those things when someone asks like, how's your day been? It can almost be like, oh, it's fine. And they're like, oh, what did I even do today? And so there is a natural part sometimes of just like kind of blanking and forgetting. And so I tell people personally all the time that like, I never want people to feel pressured to have to like know what's going on. Like that's part of my job as the facilitator of the space, is to just kind of like create opportunities. And it sometimes is, some of those sessions have been my best sessions when people come in and they're like, I actually don't even really know what to talk about. And then we end up like having really incredible discussions and things. And so it can be a way that we can explore maybe something that hasn't been explored in a while, or sometimes they're just fun, chatty sessions, because there's obviously people need to be healing and they should get their money's worth up for like the service that they're paying for. And there's also an element of sometimes life is just okay. And to just live and reflect and validate like the journey and kind of how a person got to this space where they feel okay can also just be like really, really refreshing. I think the only time when I'm kind of tilting my head at it is if I have somebody who is doing zero work, like outside, like they're in therapy and then they totally just they just never think about it ever again. And then they come back and that mode is still kind of turned on. And so then they're just like, I don't really know what to do or what to say. And that's when I may encourage some reflection, or even just like a few minutes before session, like tune into yourself and try to figure out like what's going on, so that we're not constantly disconnected from the self.
Yeah. Because how do you get connected? It's like getting connected, getting plugged in, but then going deeper within that hour, once a week or every other week or so. It's like, that's a lot of work for somebody who's not already tapped in a little bit with some sort of reflection.
Yes, exactly. And that's what I tell people all the time, is that therapy is such an odd thing in the sense that it's one of the only things that people have. If you're doing it weekly, it's one of the only things where you have a weekly appointment where you do this one thing every single week, outside of something that's like movement or fitness related or like training for something. Like there isn't much else that we do that consistently. And so it can sometimes feel like a lot, but truthfully, like you just mentioned, the grand scheme of things, it's only an hour. It's 1 hour in the entire week. And so there's so much to do, to process, to like sift through. And then you just have to be done and hope that it's enough for you to be able to chew on for the rest of the week following. So, yeah.
Especially because you're dealing with issues that it's not like you're dealing with an issue like, oh, somebody yelled at me at work for 10 minutes. You're dealing with issues that have happened for years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That have happened to people for years, certain traumas that have been going on for years, and we have to unpack that within an hour.
Right.
You know?
Yes. Oh my gosh. The first session is always just so wild, because I'm like, who is this human? Oh, I have an hour to know them. Okay, cool. Like and now that I'm in private practice and I can kind of like make my own rules, that feels like less of a burden. But especially if you work for any sort of company that like only deals with insurance or any sort of regulation like that, there's so much pressure to know a person's entire story in 1 hour, especially when you've never even there's no relationship, there's no rapport. Like, do they even trust you at all? And so it's a very interesting experience when that happens.
Yeah, I'm actually pulling it up right now. Crap. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Reclaim Your Personhood. That's what it was. When you were on the other podcast called the Wild Dog Pod, you talked about insurance and the limitations in therapy, and how you as a therapist, it's almost like, I was actually floored, which I wasn't surprised, but at the same time, I was like a little bit surprised and like, holy crap, that you as a facilitator for healing from other people, and it's going to look different because we're all unique people with our own unique issues. Mm-hmm. It's going to be different for everybody, but you almost become this quote unquote robot cookie cutter of like, well, this insurance company wants me to know all this. So there's a set of questions I have to ask these 20 people, let's say these 20 different clients that are wildly different, but I'm putting them in this little box. And it feels like also linking it to the education system of, we're taking hundreds of kids and, oh, you're going to take a standardized test. But we all learn differently. Mm-hmm. We all take tests differently. And I've never suffered from like being nervous on a test, but I know people that get really nervous taking a test. Incredibly intelligent people, but you're sitting in a test and then suddenly everything goes out the window. And I'm just like, something that you want to be tailored to you, suddenly it's standardized and it's corporate, and that sucks. I feel like my point of it is just, I'm sorry, that sucks.
It's definitely, it does suck. It is probably, and it's always so conflicting because on the one hand, insurance can be a beautiful thing in terms of providing accessibility to
Absolutely.
people. And on the other hand, it is incredibly frustrating. Like if I have somebody who is deeply struggling and they can only use my services through insurance, like they really cannot do anything else outside of that, and they're struggling, I have to somehow manage to give them 1 hour a week instead of being able to bill their insurance for even like 2 sessions a week. If I wanted to do that, I would have to prove, quote unquote, prove to the insurance companies that they're in this like ginormous crisis. And so it doesn't even allow me to be preventative in that sense either. Like, unless you have like, and I mean like potentially need like a residential program or something, that's the only time when you're kind of nearing that, when insurance companies, at least for the ones that I've worked with, when they'll approve that kind of stuff. And so it can really be just very, for me, the way I navigate it is it's just a game. And you just learn how to play the game. And so that's what I do. I try as best as I can to keep the cookie cutter out of the space, and I just allow it to happen whatever needs to. And then I take the information. I'm like, all right, so how do I put the pieces in this cookie cutter situation? And then that is, I just let that be my burden. And so the clients don't need to like worry about that or fret about it or anything. And I do what needs to be done so that people get the care that they need.
That's pretty awesome. I think that takes incredible sensitivity to take the burden on to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that's kind of an interesting segue, because in my mind, I've been, of course, listening to your story. And in my mind, I've been like, I have your dad, then I have your mom, and I'm sure she had her own little heartbreak on, I know, when he came out and they got divorced. So this idea of, crap, I just missed the word. This idea of being sensitive to different people, to different people's, and what their own burden is, because you talked about how from your mom's side it was very religious and you got to pray for this person because this and that, and you're like, well, this doesn't align with who I know this person to be. Would you give that credit to that, of your sensitivity towards people and like listening to their stories?
Yeah, I definitely, especially because like, so even timeline in terms of like what was going on in society when I was about like, and I'm going to give a range because I can't remember the exact days, like between the ages of like 13 to like 16 was when gay marriage was becoming legalized. And so there was these like, at that moment, not only am I a teenager, so I'm also just like bumbling around life and not knowing what I'm doing, but now I'm like in this position where there's so much happening around me, so many people with so many opinions. And I am just like, all I want to do is just like love my dad. And I also want to be accepted by people who I also think love me. And it was an odd thing of never being able to fit in. At least that's how I felt, because I never really felt like I fit in with Christianity. I didn't tell people for the longest time because I didn't know my parents had to tell me my dad was gay. I never put two and two. He lived with a boyfriend for a while, and I just had no idea.
It just was that's dad, and that's life. Yeah.
Yeah, which is also fascinating to take note of. Like, it just wasn't a big deal until it was.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah. So I was told, my mom, like, and I just so deeply appreciate my mom, like, given just her belief system and exactly what you're talking about, like her own emotions and things surrounding it, and kind of like, what does this mean? And she was being told the same things that I was being told. So like that, there's a lot of emotions to sift through. And especially just being a mom and trying to do the best for your kids. And she did the very best she could to kind of talk to me about it. And it ended up being like a very emotional conversation. And I remember being told and not really understanding. Like, I was just like, okay, like like, what does that mean? Like it wasn't like, hey, your dad's gay. And I was like, like, oh my gosh, like that wasn't my reaction. I was just like, okay. And then there were like emotions that were coming forward. And then I was like, oh, okay, this means something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the time, I honestly can't remember how old I was, but I was probably like 9, 10-ish, something like that, maybe even 11. So I was like still pretty young. And then, but then I told my friends. I had a few best friends in elementary school that I told, and they ended up telling the whole school. And at the time, we lived in a very small town where everybody was Catholic, and I just got made fun of so much.
Really?
Yeah, I would come home sobbing, like the whole thing of saying that I don't want to go to school again. And so that instance taught me, this is dangerous information. You cannot tell people this. So I just didn't. I never told people until I was in college. That's when and even when I started telling people, I was like, hey, like my dad's gay. Like it was this, like, it still felt like a whisper. And now I'm in a place where it's just like, I've processed so much around that and it's just not a thing anymore for me. But I honestly, I'm so sorry. I can't even remember the specific question you asked, but yeah, that was kind of part of the, that was kind of part of the journey for me in that regard.
It sounds like in some way your dad coming out created your own story of coming out. Like not your own story. I'm trying to like word it correctly, because you were the one that had to be like, you felt the fear of like, hey, somebody in my life is gay. And you felt the fear of what it's like to actually come out.
Yes.
As almost him as a gay person. That feeling almost it sounds like it was put onto you in some way. And it brought me to this memory of like, let's say you're at Disney World or something, right? And then kids are everywhere and there's the parade going on with all the Disney characters. And I just hear parents being like, isn't that cool? Don't you like that? And I'm like, let the kid enjoy.
Yes.
Like, or let the kid hate. Let them have their own experience. And for you, taking it back to you, it sounds like, of course, this is all my perspective. I'm asking you so you can debunk the whole thing or talk about it more, but it sounds like it to me. When I see children or teenagers, they don't make a big deal out of anything. They just, oh, that's it. That's dad, that's mom, that's life, that's food. I like it, don't like it, whatever. It's my own experience, until somebody goes, you should feel guilty about that. Like indirectly they put it onto you, but like, that's shameful. That's this, that's wrong. And you're like, is it? And then that's what it sounded like when you learned that, unfortunately, saying that was dangerous. It was very secretive, important information that it's like, oh crap. Something that wasn't a big deal suddenly is like, people actually care about this, and it reflects back on me, something that's not even mine. Suddenly I'm being made fun of for it.
Yeah.
So do you see that pattern in your clients of like things that were made a way bigger deal than they really are, and these feelings that were given to us like shame, we take it and go, I accept it, and it just becomes a part of them?
This applies to every single human being that I've ever come into contact with.
Really?
Truthfully, because the messages we receive from society, from loved ones, it does shape us. I genuinely believe that we are hardwired for connection, even in terms of like our nervous system and how we regulate and co-regulate with people. Like there is a lot to be said about community and about connection with people. And so as positive as that is, there's also, there's always an opposite side to the coin. And so the inverse of that is something that can be very damaging. And we can take a look at that with gender. We can take a look at that with who our romantic interests are. We can talk about that, who we are, even like within our personality. So many times I've spoken to like, and this is very generalized gendered, but like I speak to a lot of women who say that they were shamed for having anger or for having an opinion or being assertive. And then I talk to men who say that they've been shamed for crying or shamed for caring. And so we're always receiving feedback. And I've even, because a lot of the work that I do is working with people who have survived sexual violence, just like on the spectrum of it. And there's so much to be said about a person's first sexual experience and how their parents responded to that. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a story of someone saying like, yeah, I told my parents I had sex for the first time and I got grounded.
Oh, wow.
Or I got my phone taken away, or I got punished somehow, or they beat me, like, or I was scolded for something. And so that can even create a lot of sexual shame. And that's something I see constantly. And the same, I mean, that even is, I'm about to go on a whole thing here. So that's even applies to trauma, because if someone has a traumatic experience and you go up and you tell somebody, if someone shames you for that, or if someone doesn't believe you, that is going to create such a disconnect and such a disruption to the healing process. I find that if people have experienced trauma, tell someone and they're validated, the healing process is so much smoother as opposed to when they're not. And that's when I see the most severe PTSD symptoms in people, is when they're invalidated by their trauma. And again, that is family, friends, that's the legal system. If you get a guilty or not guilty verdict for whatever has happened to you. So we're receiving messaging 24/7 that lets us know, is this okay or is this not okay?
Wow. I have so many questions now because I don't know which one to ask first, but I feel like I'm going to go here. So we're talking about all these things that people that were receiving information, right? And then taking it back to you, like you grew up and then your dad's situation also kind of grew up with you. Your mom being that Christian side, and I do want to talk also about your leap into like more spirituality, but then that is also part of your story. And then you moving around a lot. How would you define identity and personality?
What a fantastic question. Again. Okay, let me sit with this for a second. There's so much of who we are that is okay, so let me back up even further. So this is new information for me that I think will help influence kind of what I'm about to say. So there's a ton of new research coming out that's showing that we are developing so much more than our physical aspects when we're in the womb, as not even born yet. So the latest research I saw was something on attachment, that how your attachment style begins to develop in the womb.
Wow.
How wild. Every time I geek out so much because I'm just like, that is so wild to me. And so with that information, when we think about who we are and who our personality is, I think there's so much to that. And I think there's even more that we just really don't even understand, especially in terms of like generationally, like what gets passed down to you. In terms of society, like, do you grow up in affirming environments or do you grow up in like toxic environments? In terms of your access even to your own basic needs, like, do you grow up in survival or do you grow up with just nurturing and getting everything that you need? So I think there's a lot of different things that determine your personality and your identity. But I also think that as much, and it's a whole nature versus nurture thing, which I don't believe that there's a versus. I think it's just nature, like, and nurture.
Yes.
And so there's also a part of it where there's also just like who you are. And I think too, in terms of like, who am I and what's my identity? There's so much outside influence that can absolutely like influence who you become, but then there's also just you and who you are. Yeah. And part of that is because of lived experience. Part of that is it's just all like constantly developing and constantly molding every moment of the day, in my opinion.
I love that. That was beautiful. Now I want to take it back because you talked about sexual violence and the differences between people that have had sexual experiences, which are just part of our lives, right? It's part of being a human being is having sex and have sexual experiences. And the differences between having that be like, oh, cool, okay, you know, you're celebrated in some way, but also like punished in some way. What is your point of view when it comes to sexual kinks and fetishes and how they develop?
Yeah, so I can only speak to this like to a certain extent because I have not done research. My interaction with it, and I tell clients this all the time. I have a ton of people that on social media of like sex educators that I follow and I will refer out when needed. But in terms of kinks, I think that there are I think there is absolutely consensual and safe ways to engage in sexual activity. And if you feel like you are consenting, like genuinely consenting, and you feel safe, I think that like, great. Okay. Like whatever needs to happen in those realms, then whatever makes you feel good, then like, that's okay. In terms of how they form, I definitely do think that they are formed by our, just like our identities and personalities. I do think that they are influenced by our surroundings and by our ability to live out certain things versus not. Like what things do you have to keep secret and what things can you actually just like expose to the world? I think all of that plays a huge role, not just in like the kink itself, but also just in how you engage with it. And again, like, because I'm traveling there, I'm always thinking safety, safety, safety is always my number one. And so like, how safe can you be engaging in this? And that to me is always because there are certain kinks where like they can genuinely be like perfectly fine in terms of like your overall well-being. But if you don't have access to being able to make that safe, then that's where I'm like, so it's not even about the kink itself. It's more just about like what you have access to, including education, including, my brain went blank. Yeah. Just including education, including even just access to physical like spaces and physical communities that can support you and validate you in those realms. So yeah, that's kind of a brief answer to that question.
Yeah, I see it a lot, like in people that like once we're consent to engaging some sexual activity, and let's say halfway in, you're like, turns out I don't really want to anymore. Like this isn't it, or
Yes.
they say something kind of weird, right? And you're like, I don't really feel, I'm not into it anymore. Maybe you're still safe, but you're like just not into it. We don't have the, I think the education yet to say, hey, can we stop? Like I'm kind of done. So I think especially if I may generalize, especially for women, right? I
Mhm.
actually talked about this already in a few other conversations, but I was in this live and it was super fun. She was selling like a bunch of like different items. And then one of the items was like these resin little animal keychains. But the animals of the ears of the animals were like very pointy. So they were for safety, for like for you to stab somebody if you get attacked.
Yes.
And I'm like, yeah, awesome. This should be like more widely received. Everyone needs it, or every woman needs it. And then the flip coin is like, oh, every woman needs it. Like you
Yeah.
can't walk around safely in the middle of the night being like without this weapon. And at the same time, especially I think if you meet somebody at a bar, you go to their hotel room, whatever, and you're like, hey, this is fine. I don't really want it anymore. Are you safe enough to say no and then walk away? And then how much you say, you're like, you know what, for my own safety, I'm just going to go with it. I don't want to. And I think even that no, even though you are consensual about it, and let's say we're talking, of course, from a safe perspective ish, right?
Mhm.
But you're like, I don't really want to say no because I'm already too committed or whatever. That's still, am I safe to assume that it still causes some sort of like emotional and mental damage to go through that thing that you're like, I don't want to, but I'm going to?
100%. I actually like very deeply appreciate you bringing this up in this way because so again, just to provide further context for me, a huge part of my work has been working with survivors of sex trafficking. And that work, you really have to get into the nitty-gritty of what is consent. Like, what does that even, like, what actually is that?
Mhm.
Because, I mean, not only exactly like you're describing, there's nuance and like, I did agree to this, but now I'm actually not into it. And so now I kind of don't know what to do. I feel like uncomfortable and I don't feel like I have the assertiveness or the authority to say no. There's power dynamics at play that come into that. And there's also how would I, the best way right now, presently, I can describe this is there's also personal beliefs
Mhm.
that can put us in situations where we are technically consenting to, but maybe it's just because it's all we think we're worth. And I bring that up because in sex trafficking, so I specifically worked with minors, so teenagers, they were younger than 18, and they almost all of them were in foster care. So that was a lot of the work I did. And one of the largest barriers to treatment that we had to navigate was running away. They run away all the time to go right back to their traffickers. It is a genuine, huge problem to have to navigate. The only time where that wasn't a huge problem was when I was working at a safe house that was located in the boonies. Like, so like it's like, if you were to run, you might actually get eaten by an alligator. Like, so people just like wouldn't like people, like the girls just like wouldn't run. But so that experience really, again, with this nuance, like it showed like these girls were technically consenting. They wanted to go back, and they're teenagers, and obviously with like underdeveloped brains, but not fully developed brains yet, just because of like their age and like life development. But to their knowledge, they said, this is what I want. Like, I want this arrangement. I want this agreement, and I will risk every single thing. I will risk my probation. I will risk my future. I will risk everything to go back to that. And so that is where it becomes more of a thing of like, you just have to make sure that you're healing constantly. And you have to be curious about yourself at all times. Why do I like the things that I like? Why do I believe the things about myself that I believe? And just see where that lands to you. And so I think all of that rhetoric as well applies to kinks, and kind of like, why do you enjoy things that you enjoy in a sexual manner? It's an important question to ask.
Absolutely. This healing process is a tough one, but at the same time, it's an interesting one because we start to realize that the way we act and behave was like conditioned and almost like given to us and put on us. And it's like, is that constant question of like, who are we underneath all this? Why am I going back to something? This is, to bring my own story a little bit, this is recent, and in no way, shape, or form, maybe it's, of course, not to that extreme, right? Of these women going back, but going back to like self-worth. There was this guy I was seeing for a little bit over like almost 2 years, and very good looking, whatever. But at the same time, I was just fully being used for him to masturbate with me, because I would go there, I would blow him, we would kiss like sometimes. And I remember thinking, oh, he's so nice because he's asking me how my day was.
Yeah.
And it's like, and then I would leave. And it's like, wait a minute. Sure, he's a nice guy. I never felt unsafe with him. But at the same time, where am I in the situation? I'm fully just a tool for masturbation for him. And I'm getting no pleasure out of it. I'm consenting to it. But it really made me ask about the self-worth and being like, why am I here? Why do I keep coming back to the situation that I'm doing something I enjoy, let's be honest, but at the same time, I'm also not getting something that I would very much enjoy, right?
Yeah.
And I know I'm not going like, oh, I want to be together with him, I'm going to fall in love and be amazing. I'm not that delusional. Although we can definitely get there, And I'm not going to deny that in the beginning I didn't think about it.
Yeah.
And I had to process that. And I remember like leaving his place, and like as soon as I turned away, I would start crying because I'm like, oh, we're not going to be together. Like, he's not the one, he's not it. And then underneath that, realizing, oh, I'm just really a tool for him to get pleasure. And then underneath that, realizing, oh crap, this is how low I think of myself. That I keep coming back to it for 2 years. That's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
it's literally my longest relationship. When I've been in a quote unquote committed relationship, it's lasted a few months. This has been my longest one, and it's not even a relationship. So the little thin thread that connects this story to these women, to these girls, really, of going back to their oppressors, right? I guess linking it to lack of self-worth, because you grew up in that environment. How would you even know what self-worth is if all that you've known is I am just to be used for other people's pleasures, and I'm powerless to run away.
Yeah.
I don't really have a question to like, or how to I don't even know how to continue this, but it's just what brought to my mind is like family connection really builds, and it kind of like in some way dictates our self-worth and what we do with it, right?
Exactly. 100%. And I think that, it's so important. First off, I deeply appreciate you sharing that. And I think that it's, even to almost like sidetrack to then come right back, it is the exact same theme. It technically maybe is not as like grandiose as maybe some of the other examples I gave, but you're exactly like just what you said. It when we boil it down, it's the same thing. It's self-worth. It's conditioning. It's all of these like very common aspects. And so we can absolutely learn from, and even in my life, like through that work, I've even like seen that, observed that, and then had to go to my own therapist and say, so why am I doing the things that I'm doing? And this can be applied to everything. This can be applied to our sex life. This can be applied to the food that we eat. This applies to the work that we have, like, or the job that we have. This applies to so much of our life in terms of like, I tell people all the time, just be curious about yourself and really understanding that like, you have several parts to you, but these parts are all deeply interconnected. So it's not like, oh, I just like, this is just only exclusive to my sex life, but then this doesn't apply to anything else in my life. Like, nope, it all applies. It all connects. Like you're a deeply integrated, connected human being. And it's just a matter of like understanding that integration and connection.
I think the ego is so strong because we don't want to be wrong, right? And I remember starting therapy, actually before I started that, doing my own self-work. And I remember making this video on YouTube, and I deleted it since then because I actually have other ideas for that video. So I'm going to definitely re-release it. But I titled it, I Admit Defeat, because I've been bullied every day of my life growing up in Brazil, right? I moved to the US when I was 14. So imagine from when you start school, let's say 5 to 14, being called a fag, gay, a girl, like every day. And I'm like, first of all, you're right. Second of all, calling me a girl, that's awesome. Women are incredibly powerful. So that's a compliment. Thank you very much. But I can say that now. Of course, back then it meant to be hurtful.
Yeah.
And I remember making it my story of like, no, I'm not bothered by it. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't hurt me, until I'm older, in my 20s, even early 30s. And I'm like, I can't keep a relationship. I don't trust anybody. And I remember doing this work of looking around at me like, I'm very comfortable and I only know women, which is great. I love women and I love having women as friends. And I'm classifying myself as a feminist. But at the same time, where are my guy friends? Like, why can't I have a guy friend? It's like, oh yeah, because I'm not admitting defeat. I'm not admitting the fact that growing up aspect really affected me. And it's affecting my relationships with other people. So, and then I created this work of like, okay, now I'm going to try and make male friends and be comfortable around men. And now I'm like better at it. So it's pretty awesome. But it does bring this idea of like, so it has to do with the influence of other people. And we have to admit the idea that like, oh, that's right. The ego being right all the time. I had to admit that I'm wrong. Meaning I had to admit that I'm wrong and thinking it didn't bother me when it really did on the surface. So I find that people do that too, right? And I'm assuming, we shouldn't assume, but I am, that you're finding that in your clients too. That like, I don't want to admit that this really bothered me. I don't want to admit that this is still affecting me to this day. It happened over 20 years ago, so it shouldn't bother me, but it still does. So what's that ego work like for you?
Yeah. So it is, I mean, exactly like you're stating, it's a very common thing because if you're ever put in a position where your ego has to almost like overcompensate, it's genuinely because you've had to overcompensate for power that people were taking from you.
Wow.
And so even in that sense, I think for a time it's okay. And I think that there is something to be said about just getting yourself through the stuff because we don't always have an out. And so sometimes, yeah, then and that's survival. So it's just
Yeah.
like surviving, get through it. But then when you are in a place where you can breathe and you are in a place where you can, because that's even a luxury too in itself of being able to have a safe space to take apart your life and like take a look at it. And so it's when we get into that space where we do have to shift the mind of like, okay, it's not even so much that it didn't bother you. You definitely like moved through it and you definitely still were able to like be alive today and take it one step at a time, which is a huge feat in itself. And it's something that should never, ever be overlooked or minimized. And yeah, but to kind of really answer your question, what that work looks like, this actually just happened to me a few weeks ago with somebody who I was working with. And you just kind of like find an emotion or something that feels very disruptive in a person's life. And you just track, like, when have you felt this way? When's the earliest? Earlier than that? What about earlier than that? And then you start to see how things build. And you're like, oh, wait, I do this because of this, because this happened, and then this. And it all begins to actually make sense and be mapped out instead of just like, well, this is who I am. I'm just born like, this is it.
Yeah, and it's like it doesn't have to be it. If you're
Right.
unhappy, it doesn't have to be it.
Yeah.
We have something that took me a while to understand in the spiritual community is we love talking about taking our power back. And I was like, what that mean? You know, what that
Right.
is. What you mean? And it took me a lot to learn, but it's exactly this. It's my life has looked this way for a certain time. I've created this pattern for a while. I'm definitely not happy with this pattern, but it's all I know. But we have to take the leap into the unknown and take the power back and go, I have sovereignty to say yes and no to things that make me happy, or that will, or that just make you feel better. Right. And it's
Yeah.
not about like, well, my mom said this, or my dad said that, or my culture says this. It's like, well, how can we go beyond that culture? Which is, God, our need for belonging as human beings is so deep.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder if we can go beyond our community and our culture. We can, but
Yeah. And I definitely think it just becomes almost like sometimes even redefining what it means to belong to people or a group of people. Because that's often a lot of work too that gets done, especially because another thing that I've kind of fallen into, which I'm obsessed with, but it's something I wasn't specifically planning on, which is navigating a lot of work with people who are deconstructing their Christian faith. And so I do a ton of like, okay, this is what it meant to belong in this religion. And so what would it look like to belong anywhere else? And even kind of like redefining those terms and what that feels like, even in your body. Because again, kind of to echo something you've already mentioned, that it just becomes all we know. And so sometimes and even again, sometimes my work is just like, can we dream? Like, are we able to think of other things? And sometimes people say no. And sometimes the answer is no. And that's even a sign that there's work to be done in that route. But if we can dream and if we can begin to say, you know what, actually, yeah, I do. This would be my dream scenario, or that shows me that there's a level of connection to something that's been hidden or something that's been squashed inside of a person.
actually, that's a beautiful segue where you talked about. I actually wrote down redefining what it means to belong. I think that might be the title of this episode because I thought that was incredibly brilliant. I mean, you said so many brilliant things that I want to listen to this episode over and over again. But can you deconstruct for us, from your perspective, what it was for you to actually, that's a weird sentence. Can you walk us through your own deconstruction of Christianity into your spiritual practice?
Yes, I can. I absolutely can. So, kind of like I mentioned, my dad has a huge part to play in that. I flip-flopped constantly between wanting so badly to be the best Christian ever and like deeply belong in that community to just being like, F this, like, I'm so over this, like, there's nothing bigger than humans, like, and I just kept like very ferociously flip-flopping to one end or the other. And it wasn't until I started the time when I can pinpoint when like big shifts were happening were when I was in my undergrad spilling into my master's education, where I was beginning to work with people who just had the most opposite upbringing that I did. And so I worked with a local nonprofit, again, like in my undergrad going into my master's, where it was an after school program for kids in impoverished communities. And I specifically worked at a satellite campus with this pretty big organization. And so we were like in this neighborhood where it was notoriously known for all sorts of violence and all sorts of drug use and just things of that nature. And it was through that experience where the things I was told, specifically from Christianity, just really also continued to not make sense. It already wasn't super making sense with my dad, but then I was really kind of engaging with other people, again, who were just very much outside of anything I've ever known. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. Like, I will never, this may not seem to relate, but for me in the grand scheme of things, this totally relates in terms of there was this one kid at the after school program who just like would, he would like, it appeared on the outside that he would pick fights, but truthfully, he was just a small, scrawny kid who was just getting picked on all the time. And he would like fight back and he would not back down. And at one point, this was like when I was fresh into this place, and I sat him down, like I thought the good person that I was being. And I was like, oh, you know, like fighting isn't good and blah, blah, blah. And he looked at me dead in the eyes. This kid was so small. He's probably like 7 years old. And he was like, they're going to beat me up the moment you leave. So what's the difference?
Oh, wow.
And I just was so stunned. And then he ran off to go play basketball. But I was just sitting there and I was like, oh my gosh, he's right. And so that thing of like, I came into this community that I don't belong to, that I did not grow up in, that I don't even live in. And I tried to instill this set of values onto this kid. And he was like, in what world? Like literally in what world is what you're going to say? Like, how is that going to help me? And it didn't. And it wasn't going to. Like what I had to offer him in that moment, that conversation was not helpful for him. And it was not something that could be applied. He needed to fight because he was right. Like kids were picking on him and kids were beating the crap out of him. So
you thought you had a lesson to learn. Turns out you had a lesson to teach. Turns out you had a lesson to learn.
Yes, exactly.
You had to learn something and grow from it.
Yeah. And so that applies to my deconstructing journey, because that was really, I really started to learn, like, you can't take these pre-designed set of ways of being and just plop them onto people. That's just not how life works. And the more I worked with therapy, the more I worked, again, just continuously working with people who were so outside of what I grew up with, just the more real that became. And the more I was like, oh, we've got to get creative. Like we really need to think outside the box. We really have to figure out, how can I assist this individual instead of like, how can I move my agenda forward? Which is very toxic Christian for sure.
Yeah, because then it goes back to like admitting that you're wrong. We don't want to, right?
Right.
Or admitting that they're not that you're wrong, but that there are infinite different points of views in the world, and making that work for them. Hearing you talk from the beginning to like now, there just seems to have this constant wheel of you being very observant and seeing people kind of for what they are, but also asking the questions. Because you said Christianity never made sense to me, these certain things, but I wanted to be a Christian. And hearing this kid talk, and you were stunned by it, which means you allowed yourself to process what he said to you, versus like, oh, he's never going to learn, he needs Jesus, and walk away. And trying to make sense of things, we talked about identity and personality, and it sounds like a big part of your identity, if I may classify you as that, is that you always had this innate ability to see things for what they are, understand and make no sense in the grand scheme of things, ask the questions, and dive deeper. Would you attribute that to anything, or just your own soul?
I definitely think there's a few. So first off, I genuinely appreciate you saying that about me. That's one of the kindest things anyone's ever said to me, about me, or observed about me. Like, I'm so appreciative, and I'm like filled right now with like, oh, like, yeah. So I just really appreciate, I don't even know what I'm feeling, but for those listening, I just moved my hands up into the air because I don't know what I'm being filled with right now, but it's something that feels great.
Thank you very much. That means a lot. And I mean it. It's what I'm observing in you. And I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you. Thank you. I definitely think if I had to narrow it down to anything beyond my dad and just kind of navigating that from such a young age, I also was put in positions growing up where I had to take care of a lot of people. And when you have to take care of a lot of people, you naturally just become very observant. And there were certain dynamics that I grew up with that I had to learn to be observant, like to observe before you act, very quickly. Like that was absolutely something I had to learn growing up. And I mean, even just like moving around all the time, like you have to, as a new person, you have to, if you want to kind of figure out how to navigate this new environment, you kind of have to sit back a bit and observe who's doing what's doing who, like, what is everything about? And so I think those attributes definitely led to me being observant. Where it does kind of teeter into like an unhealthy thing is when I lose my assertiveness, or I lose my ability to define like solid, grounded, like opinions or theories on things, or when I feel like I don't have a say and I'm just an observer. And that's where it can really be pulled into something that kind of keeps me back instead of allowing me to move forward into something positive.
You brought up something really interesting. So one thing that I've observed as well is that, like, you talk about moving a lot, and you also talked earlier about safety, how it's incredibly important for you. And just in your own work with sexuality and work with different clients, safety is incredibly important. So moving, and you're the new kid, you had no choice but to observe, because you're like, who's safe to hang out with? Who's safe to talk to? Somebody said this to me years ago, and it stuck with me, and I kind of want to put it on here. He said, because I was very observant, I didn't notice that about myself, but he said, you're kind of quiet and observant because you see people and you gauge how deep you can go with each one. And I feel like, if I may bring that and put it on you, I think you kind of learned how to do that very quickly and very early, of like, I'm this new kid, how deep and how personal can I get with different people? And if I'm not feeling personal with you, that's fine. I'm going to go with this guy or this girl. But that's what it sounds like too. And you also talked about the idea of being assertive. And that's where I really want to get to in the question of, how do you become an assertive person and form your own ideas when you are dealing with so many different aspects of life and so many different walks of life? Every person is a different walk of life. How do you bring it back to the self and go, how do you not constantly go, I'm wrong in saying this because it's not their experience? Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. One of the things that one of the things that helps me for sure is that I have to know myself fully and completely 24/7. Like, I've been in therapy. So I've been in therapy on and off for a really long time. I started when I was younger. My mom was trying to put me in therapy because of the divorce, but we kept finding, they kept sending me to Christian therapists who just were not, like, I literally had one person open a Bible in the session to like So it was just terrible. But I then found another therapist when I was 16 because I was really, really, really going through some stuff then, some like really intense mental health, and she was amazing. And so then I've been in and out of therapy ever since then. So I am almost to a fault, just continuously trying to explore myself and understand myself. And through that level of exploration, I'm able to, in the moment, try to decipher, okay, is this my thing, or is this like, is this coming from me and like my own thing, or am I actually speaking like a fact into the space? And so it can get tricky sometimes. And it definitely, like, I will get a little more assertive as I know someone better, because I do like to allow the humility to enter in that. Like, I tell people, I tell my clients this all the time, like, I don't know you and I will never know you as well as you know yourself. Like, I just never will. And so even in that, another like almost like safety measure I like to add into the therapy space specifically is, I tell my clients all the time, if I'm wrong or if I feel like I'm not saying it, like, you tell me. And I will not be offended in any way. And it's happened. And I just recently had a client who, like a younger client, and she was like, I like what you said and what you did like really upset me. And we were able to process it. And it was more in the way that like things were verbalized. And when we walked through it, she was like, oh, she was like, I get it. And I was like, I am so sorry. Like, I definitely did not mean for it to come out that way. And so, and now we're kosher. We're super great. And so it's just like, that is another thing, because like there will be moments where I will say something and it's not the actual truth. And so having those things in place keeps me in check. And it again allows like the transfer of power so that clients feel like they actually like have the power to say yes or no to me as well, because that has to be there.
That is incredible. I gotta say, that's incredible. I have no other words for it other than just that's incredible. Because I think people come to therapy and they have this vision of therapy. I certainly do, where, oh, this person has studied. They know a lot. They're the ones studying me. So what they say is right. When it's like, they're just a human being on the other side. They may be more educated they may be more eloquent on how to say certain words in the therapy world, in the psychology world, but it doesn't give them the final word. And to open up the space, again, the safe space for the client, and give the client power to say, hey, didn't really like what you said, that didn't really make sense. Let's talk about it. It's so incredibly powerful and so incredibly empowering to the client that I'm like, holy shit, if I didn't love you before, I'm fully in love with you now. And I'm totally going to stalk you from now on. No, but that was so awesome. And I have to say that, period. That's it. End of sentence. That was amazing.
Oh, again, I genuinely appreciate that reflection and that feedback. And I want to validate just you and because this is like, it's perceived that way because I think to a certain extent it is presented that way. And I do think that there are people therapists who firmly believe that they know what's right and wrong. And so even within that, like, this can become a conversation of like, and this is, I try to tell people this all the time whenever I'm with someone who's trying to find a therapist, like, you are hiring someone just like you would a handyman for your house, or a plumber if you need plumbing issues, like, or if you have plumbing issues, like, you're hiring someone to come in. And so even that has been lost over the years in terms of, I think sometimes people think that it's like, will this therapist take me? Like, am I worthy of this therapist's time? And it's like, dang, is this therapist worthy of your time? Is this therapist worthy of your safety and trust and vulnerability? And that is absolutely, like, it's not what I was taught in school. I had to learn that because of the intense environment that I basically, like, career-wise grew up in, like, working with people. I had to totally just like dismantle essentially what I was like taught in school. And I had to learn how to sit for this has happened to me so many times. I have had to sit for a full hour in a session in complete silence because they don't want to talk, but they're also not going to leave. And so we just sit there.
Oh, wow. Really?
No one says yes. That has happened to me. And one time I asked the person if I could bring a book, and they said yes. But
like, I'm going to read if you're not going to.
Right. I was like, well, if you're okay with it. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. I was like, okay. So I just like, I had to totally dismantle how I viewed or how I was like essentially like presented that therapy was, and do something completely different with it.
Wow. I think that's definitely a myth you kind of debunked for us, which is this idea of like, oh, this therapist is up on the pedestal. And it's like, I love what you said about, is this therapy worth of my time and my story, you know? And you also actually kind of opened up my eyes a little bit, because my own therapist never really said it in those words of like, hey, if I'm wrong, challenge me. But she does whenever she says, hey, I'm noticing this. And then she always asks, does that make sense? And you kind of opened my eyes now, which kind of in hindsight is like, it's so obvious. But for me, it's not. Where I feel this pressure of like, I have to answer, yes, it does make sense. When really, I feel like that question from her is just saying, does that make sense? If it does not, let me know. We'll talk about it. But I haven't, in my own little, maybe inner child mind of, I need to like be small and the adult is the correct one. You kind of opened my eyes to that of like, oh, I can answer if it makes sense or not. I don't have to say yes every time. So thank you for that. Thank you for that indirect insight. I appreciate that.
No, absolutely. And I think too, and again, just to genuinely like validate kind of what you're experiencing with that therapist too. And this is like no shade to anybody ever. There's also, your wording is so important, because even does that make sense? That implies like, do you get it?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes.
And so I'm not saying that that's their intention, but phrasing is super important. So even for me, if I'm making an assumption, or if I'm trying to like even maybe declare something or make a reflection, I will say, correct me if I'm wrong, blah, 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 blah. And that even kind of opens up a different way to kind of think of that invitation of correction. And I personally am very just aware of the words I use, because again, of the trauma that I see. I'm assuming that your power has been taken away from you. So I'm assuming that assertiveness is just not there right now, and we have to build that. And so that's why even for me, I'm almost like I tell people constantly, I say like, correct me if I'm wrong all the time. Or I will say like, does this land with you? Or like, does this resonate at all? Or Anna, sometimes I'll say like, or do I need to or like, am I totally wrong?
Right.
And so that just like kind of allows easier access to being able to say like, yes or no. So
I love that. Jess, I want this podcast now to be just you and me talking forever and ever. I don't want anybody else.
The therapist and the therapist.
Yes. Oh my God. I could talk to you for days on end. So thank you so much. You've been incredibly generous with your time. I do have a few final questions for you.
Oh yeah, keep going. I've got no plans. I'm an introvert. I never have plans.
All right. So what does your spiritual path mean to you?
What does my spiritual path mean to me? Oh, I love this question. I think if I could answer that question as eloquently as I can, not eloquently, but effectively, I think that for me, it's been a lot of reconnecting to myself. I have found that my experience in Christianity has led to a lot of disconnection, a lot of not believing my intuition, a lot of not believing my own self, my own power, my own ability to be a human, and even my own connection to like earth and just like nature. So yeah, presently my spiritual journey is definitely about like reconnecting and empowering. So nice. I hope that answers your question.
It doesn't matter. It's your answer. That's
right.
Really the question is just a guide for whatever wants to come out. What is something that people get wrong about you?
Ooh. Oh my goodness. You ask fantastic questions.
Oh my God,
Oh
thank you.
my gosh. You ask great questions. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Let's see. I mean, there's definitely several things. But this is also, I should say this is happening less frequently because I am becoming a more assertive human. So I will say that like lately this is happening less, but one thing that I do get a lot from people, this is more clients, but a lot of people who are not like in my immediate like social circle think that I am this person who reads 24/7 and is just like this very just like every day is peaceful and all this stuff. And I actually really, I do read and I love reading and I do drink green tea and I do holistic things. So those things are definitely a part of me and I am obsessed with those parts of me. And I also watch a ton of TV. I'm obsessed with movies and television. I will sit down and watch TV all day long. And I've done that a lot. Where that's my plan. Like I don't have plans and I just watch TV and I'm a potato on the couch and that's my life and that's what I love. And I also really like I like very like gruesome things. Love I love a good thriller that's just disturbing and bizarre.
Do you love horror movies, like the gory ones?
I do. Yeah, I love gory horror movies. Those are genuinely like my all-time favorite. I don't
Nice.
yeah, and I love there was this, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm about to say this out loud, but I'm going to because it's fine. There is this show that is on Netflix. It just came out, I think, last year. It's called Brand New Cherry Flavor.
I haven't heard
I think
of it.
it's called Brand New Cherry Flavor. Something about cherry flavor.
Okay.
It's like a mini series. It is one of the most disturbing things I've seen in a very long time. I have not seen Midsummer though, so I need to add that in. That like
I do want to see that.
I've heard that is just like out of this world.
But
Brand New Cherry Flavor was this miniseries, and it was just like very disturbing. But I was so obsessed with it, and I was like, I don't think anybody knows that. I gotta stop.
That's
yeah.
awesome. Oh
So
my,
that's definitely something that people can rock about me.
I love that. Thanks for sharing.
I have a light and I have a very dark side to me as well. So
Yeah, duality. It's all
Yes.
about. Yeah. So what's something you love about yourself?
Oh, something I love about myself. I do really love how committed I am to my healing work. I do love that about myself. I mean, these past couple of years have been hard for no one has come out unscathed from these last couple of years. And I have definitely navigated some of the worst experiences that I've ever had in my life. Wow. In these last couple of years, just like even in terms of trauma, like I had a really, my brother passed in 2020 in a very traumatizing and unexpected kind of way. And I wasn't even just experiencing grief, I was experiencing trauma, like from the passing. And so it was this very complex thing. And I just like, I put myself in so much credit card debt, getting all the services I needed, getting all the healing I needed. And just, I like no savings account, like the whole thing, just living paycheck to paycheck in the name of like, I have got to keep moving, and not even keep moving, but like, I have got to move through this. Like this, I have been in moments in my life where I'm like, this thing I'm experiencing will consume me if I don't move. Wow. Like, don't stand still, or else this like darkness that's coming forward is going to just consume. And so like, I have been in positions like that in my life. So yeah, I just ferociously in every aspect of my life try to commit myself to healing, whatever that looks like in those moments. So sometimes it's therapy, sometimes not.
Yeah, there's so many modalities out there of healing. We talked about in the beginning how, when I asked how you feel about the title, and you talked about how like different modalities out there. And even in one aspect of healing, right? In grief, for example, it's not just one thing, it's many. And It's all of them, if not, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I hate when people say I'm sorry, but what else do you say, right?
Right. And that's okay.
Yeah.
There's nothing to say, so it's okay.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about how you've learned tarot, the basics, and you're constantly learning more and
Yes.
more and more. Is there a card that comes out that you're like, yes?
Ooh.
Or maybe one that's like, oh God, no.
So that used to be, I mean, I definitely used to be of that same mind of like, not the tower, not the death card, not the tower, not the death card. Like, oh no, like just totally freaked out. But honestly, and I hope this isn't a lame answer, but I genuinely am just so obsessed with every part of tarot. And I like, and I sometimes I even love when tarot gives me things that don't feel quote unquote like good. When
Mm,
I see the card, I'm like, ugh, like, why did I get this card? But it allows me to really sit and be like, okay, so like, why did I get this card? Like, why is this coming up for me? And again, like, as far as my spirituality becoming to reconnecting and even a level of like consent as well within my spiritual journey, which I haven't really had with Christianity, because you don't get a lot of like, you don't get choice in
right.
Christianity. It's the
We got
one way or the high or
yeah.
like the hell, basically. And that's literally it. It's like heaven or hell.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I love being able to sit with information and being like, how does this apply to me?
Mm,
And even that process, and maybe like, I'll get that card like I'll get a card today and I'll get that same card 6 months from now. And that card will have totally different meanings
yeah.
now and 6 months from now, even though it's the same image, it represents technically the same things. And yet how it integrates into my life is going to be totally different. So in that realm, I genuinely just like I love tarot, just like as a whole.
That makes me so happy.
Yes.
That makes me so happy. Now I'm doing the lifting the arm thing. Now, is there a book, movie, quote, or song or something that you love so much you want to share with everybody?
Oh my goodness. Let me think that I want to share with somebody. Oof. Ugh. It's like when people are like, what music do you enjoy? And it's like, what music do I enjoy? I listen to music every single day. Okay, I really need to think.
I'm one of those that like I listen to the same artist like in a loop over and over again until I'm sick of them. But then
Yes.
somebody asks me, what kind of music do you love? And I'm like, if you go blank, even though you've been listening to Bjork or Florence the Machine for the last 3 years, nonstop.
Okay, you know what? Well, since you said her name, I'm just gonna Florence and the Machine. She just released a new single.
Yes.
Oh my
So good.
God. I'm literally listening to it on repeat all the time. So I'll do this. These are the things that I'm listening to on repeat. So Florence and the Machine, I'm currently listening at her new single King. Have you seen the music video for it?
I have not. I've only seen one snippet because I think somebody shared it on TikTok, and it's that moment where she's like like vocalizing.
Yes.
Clearly, I'm not a singer, but she's doing that, and I was like, there's so much cathartic energy here that I think I need to be in the right space to watch the music video. But I want to. I'm curious.
It's so good. I watched it and the whole time my mouth was just open and I was just like silent, like,
oh my gosh.
It's amazing. So I love her. And she just throughout the years has just continued. She's always spoken to my heart.
Same.
Like she is an artist that I've genuinely grown up with. And I'm like, yeah, me too. Like, let's do this.
I saw this meme. This was years ago, but I saw this meme and it was like, everyone, right? Semicolon. And the like a song is like, oh, he loves me. We're together. Like I love you, blah, blah, blah. And then everyone's like, and then for me, it's like, can't relate. It's like can't relate. But then Florence the Machine singing about being a goddess on the mountain with her brethren, like bringing to the sea, and it's like, fuck yes, Florence. And I'm like, I have never connected to a meme so personally in my life than that one.
Yes. Yo, and that's so funny because in her part of the chorus in this new song, she says, I am no mother, I am no bride, I am king. And I am like, yes.
Me too. I was like, fuck yeah.
So funny. it's just hilarious. But yeah, we love Florence. Oh, there I am. And then the other two people that I'm definitely listening to a lot right now is Earth Gang.
I don't know them.
They're a hip hop band and they are a hip hop group, I should say. They're so amazing. They also just released a new album called, let me look it up right now. So Earth Gang is another one. And then there's another hip hop artist called Saba. And he also just released a new album. I'm just like so obsessed with, so Earth Gang's new album is called Ghetto Gods. And then Saba's new album is called Few Good Things. And I think everything from the album cover to the sequencing of the songs to the lyrics that are spoken, it's just all so amazing. So
I wrote those two down because I definitely want to listen to it.
Yay. Okay, cool. Earth Gang's a good time. Their newest album, this new album is definitely more like in their feels, but I think it's like so appropriate for just the time that we're in. If you listen to their previous stuff, they're a good time. Yeah.
Nice. And finally, how can people connect with you? You a human being of a person.
Yes, they can connect with me on Instagram. That's primarily where I just like make announcements and connect with people is through Instagram. I do have a website, promenadecounseling.com. And yeah, my Instagram is also Promenade Counseling. Yeah.
Jess, thank you so much for being on here.
Thank you so
It really
much.
meant the world to me to talk to you.
I love being here with you. And you genuinely asked such great questions.
Thank you.
Like I'm just obsessed with the questions that you asked. So we're like, and even like, we're going to bookend this. You had your selfish moment in the beginning. I'm going to have mine at the end. And I'm just going to plug in here that there's something so like my job is to sit and listen to people's stories all day, every day, 24/7. And so when someone asks me questions, just on a personal note, it just feels really good when people want to know me. So yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity and being interested in me.
And there you have it. That's our conversation with Jess Mork from Promenade Counseling. Didn't I tell you she was such a great mind? Now you know why she's one of my favorite conversations. If you guys want to connect more with me, I am on Patreon as patreon.com/Icaro Tarot. You can find me as Icaro Tarot pretty much in any social media platform if you guys want to connect with me there. But on Patreon, we do have this really nice community. And you guys get to get a lot of goodies, a lot of extra goodies that are exclusive to Patreon members. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you guys next time.